The mail-order bride thought no one wanted her, until the mountain man said, "Will you give me sons?" The mountain air was sharp that morning, carrying the faint scent of pine and melting snow. Silence hung heavy across the valley, broken only by the distant call of a raven. The cabin stood alone, dark timbers weathered by storms, smoke from its crooked chimney curling weakly into the pale sky. A man leaned against the post of the porch, his broad frame rigid, his face marked by years of solitude. His name was Elias, a mountain man by birth and by necessity. The world had carved its hardness into him, yet his eyes, pale, watchful, carried the weight of a man who had outlived both his kin and his hope. That morning, a wagon wheel cracked the silence. The sound felt foreign, almost intrusive, against the stillness of the wilderness. Elias turned, his hand brushing instinctively against the rifle by the door. He saw the driver's hunched figure, reins slack in tired hands, guiding a horse that looked half-starved from the journey. Behind him, sitting upright on the wooden bench, was a woman. Her dress was travel-stained, her bonnet tilted awkwardly, as though it had been tugged against the wind one too many times. She held her hands folded tightly in her lap, knuckles white from the grip. Her eyes, shadowed beneath the brim, did not wander like a curious stranger's would. They stayed low, steady, resigned. The wagon pulled up before the cabin. Dust settled in the pale light. The driver muttered something, climbed down, and with stiff movements, helped the woman step to the ground. She stood there awkwardly, clutching a small leather satchel that looked far too light to hold a life's worth of belongings. Elias said nothing at first. He studied her with the wary patience of a man who had seen promises turn to ash. She, in return, did not dare meet his gaze. There was something fragile about her stance, but not weak. It was the fragility of someone who had been tested too often, who had learned to survive by shrinking herself smaller each time the world tried to crush her. The driver tipped his hat to Elias, handed over a folded paper, and with little ceremony turned the horse back down the dirt trail. Within moments, the wagon creaked into the distance, leaving only the woman, the man, and the weight of the silent wilderness between them. Elias opened the paper. A name was written in careful, almost timid script. Clara May Whitfield. She was to be his mail-order bride. For a long moment, no words passed between them. Clara shifted her weight. The satchel clutched tighter, as though ready for rejection. The wind tugged at her bonnet strings. Her lips trembled, but she bit them firm. In that silence, Elias saw something he had not expected. Not beauty, not charm, but the same loneliness that had hollowed his own chest for years. And though he did not yet speak it, the thought came unbidden. No one else had wanted her, and perhaps no one else had wanted him either. Clara did not speak as she stood before the cabin. Her satchel rested against her skirts, and her hands clung to the worn handle as if it were the last thread tying her to the life she had left behind. Her eyes flicked once toward Elias, then away, her chin lowered, as though bracing for words that might cut. Inside, Elias lit the lantern and gestured toward the table. She obeyed silently, her steps small and careful, as if she feared breaking something that could never be mended. She sat, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. The flame's glow caught the hollow of her cheeks, the shadows beneath her eyes, and Elias noticed the thinness of her wrists. This was no woman pampered by comfort or fortune. This was someone already stripped by hardship. He poured water from the jug into a tin cup and set it before her. She murmured thanks, almost inaudible, and lifted it with trembling fingers. Her lips touched the rim, but she paused, as though unsure if she deserved even this small mercy. Then she drank, and a faint relief crossed her face. Elias leaned against the counter, watching her. Something in her silence unsettled him. He had expected chatter, perhaps nervous giggles or questions about the mountains. Instead, she sat as though expecting judgment, punishment, or dismissal. Her quiet obedience reminded him of the days when he had returned from the war, when widows waited by the roadsides, their faces drained of hope, their eyes hollowed by waiting for men who never came home. A memory rose unbidden, a younger Elias, kneeling beside his mother's grave. The wind had cut sharp that day too, and he had felt small, lost, unwanted. The same heaviness pressed at him now, seeing Clara clutch herself into invisibility. He wondered what had been done to her, what words had been spoken so often that she carried them still, like invisible scars. He wanted to ask, but the questions lodged in his throat. Who left you behind? What cruelty made you believe you had to sell yourself across the miles? Instead, he said nothing. Silence stretched between them, heavy as snowfall. Clara finally whispered, "If you do not want me, you can send me back." The words struck Elias like a stone. Her voice carried no anger, no plea, only a resigned certainty that she was a burden, an unwanted package delivered to the wrong door. He stared at her, and in her stillness he saw himself, every rejection, every season of loneliness that had carved him hollow. She was not asking for love, nor even kindness. She was preparing to be discarded again. Elias turned away, jaw tight. He could have sent her back. He could have chosen solitude, the familiar ache of an empty cabin, rather than risk the weight of another broken soul. He thought of the mountains swallowing her up, of her figure shrinking on the trail until she vanished, another ghost swallowed by silence. But two, he thought, burned in his chest. He knew what would happen if he let her go. She would not be taken in elsewhere. Women like her were not chosen twice. And the memory of his own mother's grave, the bitter loneliness of his youth, screamed against letting history repeat itself. He set his hands flat on the counter, steadying himself. His voice, when it came, was low, almost gruff. "You will stay." Clara's head lifted slowly, her eyes widening just enough to reveal the faintest flicker of disbelief. For the first time, Elias thought he saw the trace of something fragile but alive. Hope, trembling like a candle in the dark. The decision was made. Whether it would save them or ruin them, Elias would not send her away. The mountains were never still for long. Days after Clara's arrival, Elias noticed how she startled at every echo from the ridge, how her hand froze on the washboard when hoofbeats carried faintly through the valley. She never said it aloud, but fear lived in her body. It was the kind of fear that did not come from wilderness or wolves. It came from men. One evening, while the fire crackled low, Elias found her sitting at the table with the satchel open before her. Inside lay only a faded ribbon, a small leather Bible, and a folded letter. When she realized he had seen it, she quickly closed the satchel, as though the sight revealed too much. But Elias had already noticed the seal on the paper, a crude mark, not of family, but of debt. He said nothing then, but the silence pressed heavier. Later, when she finally spoke, her words came halting, torn from a place she had long kept shut. "My father. He sold me." Elias stiffened. She did not meet his eyes. She stared into the fire as though it might burn away the shame. "There was a man, owing money, gambling. My father promised me to settle it, but when the man came to claim me, I ran. The agency placed me here in Ted." Her voice faltered. "He will not forgive. He will come." Elias felt the muscles in his jaw lock. The image of some faceless man, cruel enough to claim ownership over a woman, burned through him. He thought of Clara's silence, her bowed head, the way she had asked if he wanted to send her back. Now he understood. She was not only unwanted, she was hunted. The following morning, Elias spotted the first sign. Tracks in the mud, too fresh to belong to him or Clara. Hooves, heavy boots, men. He followed them only far enough to confirm what he feared, then returned to the cabin. Clara was outside hanging laundry, her face pale beneath the weak sun. She looked up, reading the tension in his eyes before he spoke. "They're close," he muttered. She dropped the clothespin from her fingers. For a moment, she looked like she might crumble. Then, with quiet resolve, she steadied herself. "He will not stop until he finds me." That night, Elias kept the rifle propped against the wall beside his chair. He slept little, every creak of the cabin boards pulling him back from the edge of rest. The wilderness outside seemed to hold its breath, waiting. On the third day, a rider appeared on the far ridge. Elias watched from the shadows of the porch. The man wore a long coat, broad hat, and moved with the arrogance of someone who believed the land itself owed him passage. Two more followed, trailing behind. They lingered at a distance, scanning the valley, as though scenting prey. Clara stood behind Elias, her breath quick and shallow. "That's him," she whispered. Her voice carried a tremor Elias had never heard before, a mixture of dread and recognition. The air thickened with unspoken truth. They were not safe. Not here. Not anymore. Whatever life they had hoped to build in the quiet of the mountains was already under siege. Elias tightened his grip on the porch rail, his eyes fixed on the figures in the distance. The choice he had made days ago, telling Clara she would stay, was no longer only about shelter or kindness. It had become a promise forged in danger. If those men close hid in, it would not be just Clara's past he faced. It would be a reckoning, and Elias knew in the marrow of his bones that both their lives now hung on what he was willing to risk. The days grew colder, though spring had only just begun. Elias chopped wood at dawn while Clara gathered kindling, her skirts brushing against the frost. They spoke little, yet silence no longer felt like emptiness. It was something shared, like the breath of the mountains that carried between them. One morning, Elias placed the rifle in Clara's hands. She froze, startled by the weight, her fingers uncertain against the wood. "If they come," he said simply, "you'll need this." Her hands trembled, but she did not protest. He guided her to the edge of the meadow, set up a tin can on a stump, and stood behind her. His rough palms closed gently over her smaller hands, steadying the aim. She flinched at the first shot, but his presence anchored her. When the bullet struck the can on the third try, her lips parted with the faintest gasp of disbelief. Elias caught the spark in her eyes, something beyond fear, beyond resignation. For the first time, she looked capable. That evening, Clara prepared supper with quiet care. She kneaded the dough with sleeves rolled high, revealing bruises faintly yellowed along her forearm, remnants of a grip too cruel to forget. Elias noticed, but said nothing. Instead, he set the table and split the firewood finer, as though answering her unspoken confession with an unspoken promise. No hands here would harm her again. Later, when the cabin dimmed to the glow of lantern light, Elias sat sharpening his knife while Clara mended a tear in his coat. The room hummed with small sounds, the scrape of steel, the pull of thread. He caught her glancing at him, not with fear this time, but with quiet curiosity. "Your shoulder," she said softly, eyes lingering where the fabric strains. "Ched, tight." Elias paused, then rolled the sleeve higher. A jagged scar cut across his skin, pale and cruel, the mark of a bullet long past. "War," he muttered. No more needed saying. She nodded, her gaze lingering not on the wound itself, but on the man who had carried it. The silence that followed was thick, but not heavy. It was filled with the weight of things they did not need to speak. His years of fighting, her years of being fought against. Different battles, same scars. In the nights that followed, Clara often sat by the window, staring at the stars, as though searching for a life she'd never been allowed to claim. One night, Elias joined her. They did not touch, but their shoulders nearly brushed as they sat in the hush of the wilderness. She whispered then, barely audible, "I thought no one would want me." Elias turned to her, but she kept her gaze on the stars. He did not try to correct her with words. Instead, he stoked the fire higher, placed an extra quilt on her bed, and the next morning brought her the first blooming wildflower of the season, set quietly on the table. Small gestures, but each carried more than words could bear. Their bond was not sudden, not loud. It grew like roots beneath soil, silent, unseen, but strong enough to hold against storms. In their shared scars, in the unspoken promises of daily acts, a fragile peace settled over the cabin. But both of them knew peace could not last. Beyond the ridge, men still hunted, and that knowledge made every quiet moment between them feel like stolen time, precious and fleeting, like the calm before the inevitable storm. The storm broke at dusk. The sky bruised purple as clouds pressed low over the mountains, and the sound of hooves thundered up the valley like drums of war. Elias stood on the porch, rifle in hand, while Clara lingered just inside the doorway, her hands clutched together so tightly, her knuckles gleamed white. 3 riders came into view, their silhouettes sharp against the fading light. At the front was the man Clara had whispered about, the gambler who had claimed her as debt. His coat flared with each stride and his eyes glinted cold beneath the brim of his hat. Behind him, 2 others carried shotguns, the kind of men who moved like shadows of violence. The horses slowed as they reached the cabin. Dust swirled. The leader dismounted, boots striking the ground with the arrogance of possession. His gaze swept over Elias, then shifted to Clara, who flinched, though she tried to hide it. "She belongs to me," the man said flatly, voice like gravel. "Her father signed the paper. You've got something that isn't yours." Elias's jaw hardened. He leveled the rifle just enough to make the point clear. "She's not yours. Not anymore." The man smirked, a predator enjoying the moment before the kill. "You think you can keep her from me? I've got the law on my side. Paper don't lie." He pulled a crumpled sheet from his pocket and tossed it into the dirt. "Contract's binding. She's property until the debt's settled." Clara's breath hitched. She stepped forward, her voice trembling. "It's a lie. He forged it. My father never—" She cut herself off, fear choking the words. Elias glanced at her, then back to the man. In that instant, a truth clicked into place. Clara hadn't just run from cruelty. She had run from a noose of lies designed to strip her of freedom. The standoff thickened, silence snapping taut as the 3 men shifted their weapons. Rain began to spit from the clouds, tapping against the cabin roof like the ticking of a clock running out. Elias raised his voice, steady and low. "You'll leave now, or you won't leave at all." The gambler laughed, sharp and hollow. Then he gestured to his men. "Take her." Time broke. 1 man advanced, shotgun ready. Elias fired first, the crack splitting the valley. The attacker fell, writhing in the dirt. The second man swung his gun toward Clara, but she, with trembling hands, raised the rifle Elias had taught Hutch to use. The shot rang wild, grazing the man's arm, but it was enough to make him stumble. The gambler lunged forward, pistol flashing. Elias caught the blur of movement, shoved Clara aside, and the shot tore into his shoulder. He staggered, but did not fall. With a growl pulled from the marrow of his bones, he closed the distance, wresting the pistol from the man's grip. For a moment, rain poured around them, 2 men locked in a brutal dance of survival. Then Elias slammed the gambler into the mud, the gun wrenched free and aimed at the man's chest. But Elias did not fire. His breath came ragged, the storm roaring in his ears. Killing the man would end 1 life, but leaving him alive might end Clara's. The weight of that choice hung heavy. Then Clara stepped forward, her voice steady for the first time. "He does not own me." Her words cut sharper than any bullet. The gambler stilled, eyes narrowing, but something in her tone, the conviction of a woman no longer willing to bow, stripped his arrogance. Elias pressed the barrel harder. "You heard her," Elias said, voice like stone. The gambler spat, fury burning, but the fight drained from him as his wounded men groaned in the dirt. He stumbled back, clutching his pride more than his pain, and mounted his horse. "This isn't over," he hissed, before disappearing into the storm. Elias dropped to 1 knee, blood seeping through his shirt. Clara rushed to him, hands trembling as she tried to stop the flow. His vision blurred, but through the haze he saw her face, no longer hollow with despair, but fierce with something new. He had risked everything. And in that moment, as rain mingled with blood, Elias knew the sacrifice had been worth it. The storm passed slowly, leaving the valley soaked and heavy with silence. The rain eased to a soft drizzle, dripping from the pines, tapping against the cabin roof like muted tears. The ground was dark with mud, marked by hoofprints and blood. Clara knelt beside Elias on the porch, her hands pressing cloth against his wound. The fire of panic burned in her chest, yet her movements were steady. She whispered nothing. There were no words strong enough for what had just happened. Only the sound of her breath, quick and shallow, filled the air. Elias's eyes fluttered open. Pain carved his features, but his voice came rough and low. "I'll live." Clara shook her head, tightening the cloth. "Be still." The words trembled not with fear, but with something fiercer, an unwillingness to lose him. She had been abandoned, sold, hunted, but she would not let him slip away now. Together, they dragged him inside, laying him on the bed by the hearth. Clara worked through the night, heating water, tearing strips from her own dress to bind his shoulder. Her fingers were clumsy, but her resolve was unbreakable. She had never tended wounds of war, but she knew what it meant to keep someone alive. Outside, the valley grew quiet again. No more riders appeared. The gambler had retreated with his wounded men, pride cut deeper than his flesh. Whether he would return, neither of them knew, but for now, silence was their reprieve. As dawn crept pale over the ridges, Elias stirred. Clara sat beside him, her eyes heavy from wakefulness. He tried to rise, but she pressed him back gently. For the first time since her arrival, her touch carried no hesitation. Hours stretched in muted stillness. The world outside felt distant, like another country. Elias dozed, fever rising. And in those fragile moments, Clara found herself watching him with a strange ache. He had stood between her and the men who sought to claim her. He had bled for her. And though he spoke little, every act had said what words could not. She was not unwanted. By evening, Elias awoke fully, his face drawn, but his eyes steady. Clara sat at the window, the ribbon from her satchel tied loosely in her hands. She turned when she heard him stir. Their eyes met. No words passed, yet something deep and unspoken bound them. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and herbs. The fire popped softly. Beyond the walls, the valley lay washed clean by rain, as though the earth itself had borne witness to the night and now offered quiet. Clara rose, moving to his side. She adjusted the blanket over his chest. "Rest," she whispered. He caught her hand before she could pull away. His grip was weak, but it held more weight than strength could carry. Their silence spoke louder than speech ever could. She squeezed his hand in return, the faintest smile tugging at her lips despite the heaviness in her eyes. The danger was not gone forever. She knew the world would not change overnight. But in this cabin, in this fleeting stillness, she had found something she had never been given before, a place to belong, and a man who had chosen her not as property, not as debt, but as a soul worth protecting. As the light dimmed once more, the fire glowed warm against the shadows. Two broken lives sat bound, not by contract nor by chance, but by sacrifice and survival. And in the silence, a fragile hope began to take root. Weeks passed, and the valley slowly returned to its rhythm. Snow melted along the ridges, streams swelled with clear water, and wildflowers pushed through the damp earth as though nothing violent had ever stained the soil. Yet inside the cabin, time carried a different weight. Elias healed slowly. His arm never regained its full strength, but he bore the scar as one bears a vow etched in flesh. Clara stayed at his side through each fevered night, each weary dawn, never once speaking of leaving. What had begun as a contract delivered by strangers had become something far quieter and far deeper. Each morning she set bread by the fire, humming softly under her breath. Each evening he split wood with one arm, slower than before, yet determined. They learned the rhythm of two lives bound by necessity, but mended by choice. The silence between them no longer felt heavy. It had softened into a language all its own. One afternoon, Clara returned from the meadow with her skirts dusted in pollen and her hand. It's full of wildflowers. She placed them in a jar by the window. "To make it less lonely," she said almost shyly. Elias only nodded, but the corner of his mouth twitched towards something close to a smile. The gambler never returned. Perhaps pride had carried him elsewhere, or perhaps he knew the mountains would never bend to his will. But in his absence, a truth lingered. Danger could always rise again. Elias and Clara both understood this. Yet they no longer lived in fear. They lived in defiance of it, side by side. One evening, as the sun bled gold across the valley, Elias sat on the porch, his shoulders stiff from the wound. Clara stepped out beside him, her hands folded around a cup of tea. They did not speak for a long time. The mountains stretched endless before them, vast and indifferent. At last Elias broke the silence, his voice low, as though confessing something long held back. "I thought I'd live and die alone here." Clara's gaze lingered on the horizon. Her reply was soft, almost lost to the wind. "So did I." They sat there until the last light faded, two shadows resting against the quiet timber of the cabin. The world would not remember their names. No songs would be written, no monuments raised. Yet in that valley, in the hush after storm and sacrifice, two forgotten souls had found a kind of peace, fragile, imperfect, but real. And as the night settled, Elias reached for Clara's hand. She let him hold it. Their silence echoed like the last note of a violin, fading but unforgettable, carried into the dark by the endless breath of the mountains.